At the center of Moscow, behind fortified red walls and overlooking the slow bend of the Moscow River, stands the Grand Kremlin Palace, a structure that has outlived invasion, fire, revolution, and world war. Its survival was never guaranteed. More than once, history positioned it on the edge of annihilation, and yet it remains. The Kremlin Hill has been a seat of authority since the 12th century, when early wooden fortifications marked the rise of a minor principality. Over centuries, those wooden walls were replaced with limestone, then brick, as Moscow expanded its influence. By the late 15th century, under Ivan III, Italian architects reshaped the fortress into a statement of ambition. Cathedrals crowned its skyline. Royal residences emerged within its protective perimeter. The current Grand Kremlin Palace, however, is largely a creation of the 19th century. Commissioned by Tsar Nicholas I, construction began in 1837 and continued for more than a decade. The goal was not simply to build a residence, but to consolidate earlier royal structures into a unified symbol of autocracy. Architect Konstantin Thon blended Russian Byzantine elements with imperial scale, linking the older Terem Palace and faceted halls with vast ceremonial chambers intended to inspire awe. The palace was designed to project permanence. Ironically, its existence was shaped by prior destruction. In 1812, decades before the present facade rose above the Kremlin walls, Moscow faced one of its gravest threats. The army of Napoleon Bonaparte entered the city after the Battle of Borodino. Fires soon engulfed large portions of Moscow. Whether set deliberately by retreating Russians or ignited through chaos remains debated, but the result was devastation. Flames swept through neighborhoods, consuming wooden homes and infrastructure. When Napoleon retreated from the city, he ordered explosives placed throughout the Kremlin complex. The aim was clear: destroy the symbolic heart of Russian power. Charges were set in towers and along defensive walls. Several detonated, damaging structures and shaking foundations. Yet complete destruction never came. Rain dampened fuses. Some explosives failed to ignite. Others caused partial damage, but not collapse. The Kremlin survived. This narrow escape embedded itself into national memory. Restoration efforts began quickly after French forces withdrew. Damaged towers were rebuilt. Cathedrals were repaired. The fortress regained its silhouette over Moscow. By the time Nicholas I envisioned a new grand palace within the walls, the site already carried the weight of resilience. Construction of the Grand Kremlin Palace required demolishing older buildings and integrating historic chambers into a new architectural whole. 5 grand reception halls were named after orders of chivalry of the Russian Empire: St. George, St. Andrew, St. Vladimir, St. Alexander, and St. Catherine. Each was adorned with gilded ornamentation, polished marble, and elaborate parquet floors. The design was not merely decorative, it was political. Every arch and emblem reinforced the divine authority of the Romanov dynasty. Yet, even as the palace neared completion in 1849, the empire it symbolized faced mounting pressures. Industrialization altered social structures. Reform movements grew. The memory of foreign invasion lingered. The palace stood as a declaration of stability in a century increasingly defined by uncertainty. Throughout the late 19th century, the Tsars primarily resided in St. Petersburg, but Moscow retained sacred importance. Coronations occurred in the Kremlin's cathedrals. Ceremonial entries passed beneath its towers. The Grand Kremlin Palace functioned as a monumental stage for imperial continuity. Its architecture projected confidence. Its walls suggested permanence. But stone alone could not shield it from the internal forces gathering beneath the surface of Russian society. The palace had survived Napoleon's explosives. It had risen from reconstruction stronger and more unified than before. What it could not foresee was a threat that would not come from foreign artillery or burning rooftops, but from political collapse within its own empire. As the 20th century approached, unrest intensified. Economic hardship, military defeat, and political repression eroded faith in autocracy. Within decades, the Romanov dynasty would face its final crisis. The Grand Kremlin Palace, built to embody eternal monarchy, stood at the center of a state about to unravel. Its gilded halls had been designed for coronations and imperial banquets. Soon, they would confront an entirely different future. When revolution erupted in 1917, the world that had built the Grand Kremlin Palace vanished with startling speed. The Romanov dynasty fell, imperial authority dissolved, symbols of monarchy were dismantled across the country. The palace, conceived as a monument to autocracy, suddenly stood without its sovereign. In March 1918, the Bolshevik government moved the capital from Petrograd back to Moscow. The Kremlin once again became the administrative core of Russia, but under a radically different ideology. The transformation was swift and deliberate. Imperial eagles were removed. Religious iconography was stripped from prominent spaces. Apartments once prepared for czars were converted into offices for revolutionary leaders. The palace was not destroyed, it was repurposed. This decision was practical. The structure provided secure, fortified space suitable for governance. Yet it was also symbolic. By occupying the Kremlin, the new regime claimed continuity of authority, even as it rejected the monarchy that had commissioned its grand halls. During the 1920s and 1930s, sweeping changes reshaped the Kremlin complex. Several religious structures within its walls were demolished, including the Chudov and Ascension monasteries. Their removal marked a decisive break from the past. The Grand Kremlin Palace, however, remained intact. Its ceremonial spaces were too useful, too central, and too imposing to discard. Under the rule of Joseph Stalin, the Kremlin became synonymous with centralized power. Stalin worked within its fortified perimeter, transforming the historic stronghold into the operational heart of a modern ideological state. The palace's vast halls hosted congresses, diplomatic receptions, and official ceremonies. The same chambers that had once echoed with coronation oaths now amplified speeches of socialist policy. Adaptation became the palace's mechanism of survival. But survival faced another severe test in 1941, when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and advanced toward Moscow. The capital prepared for siege. Defensive lines formed beyond the city. Government institutions considered evacuation. Once again, the Kremlin became a potential target. Camouflage measures were implemented to conceal the fortress from aerial bombardment. Rooftops were painted in muted tones. Architectural outlines were disguised to resemble ordinary urban blocks. The distinctive domes and towers were masked as effectively as possible. Anti-aircraft defenses surrounded the complex. Despite these precautions, bombs struck the Kremlin during air raids. Some buildings sustained damage. Windows shattered. Facades were scarred. Yet, catastrophic destruction did not occur. The German advance stalled before reaching Moscow. Winter conditions and Soviet resistance halted the offensive. For the second time in little more than a century, the Kremlin had avoided devastation at the hands of a European army. When the war ended in 1945, the Grand Kremlin Palace stood not as a relic of monarchy, but as the headquarters of a victorious superpower. Its identity had transformed completely. It no longer symbolized dynastic inheritance, but ideological endurance. The building had survived revolution and total war by shedding one meaning and adopting another. Still, its architecture quietly preserved memory. Beneath layers of Soviet adaptation remained parquet floors laid for czars and vaulted ceilings designed for imperial orders. The palace functioned within a new narrative, yet its physical structure resisted erasure. As decades passed, the Soviet Union projected strength abroad, while internal strains accumulated beneath the surface. Economic stagnation, political rigidity, and public dissatisfaction gradually weakened the system that had claimed the Kremlin as its command center. The Grand Kremlin Palace had endured invasion and war. It had adapted to revolution. Now it stood at the heart of a state entering its final chapter. By the late 1980s, The Soviet Union faced mounting instability. Reform efforts under Perestroika and Glasnost opened political space, but also exposed structural weaknesses. Economic shortages intensified. Republics demanded autonomy. The authority that had governed from within the Kremlin for decades began to fracture. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. Unlike the upheaval of 1917, this transition did not bring widespread destruction to Moscow's historic core. There were no fires sweeping through the city, no artillery aimed at fortress walls. Instead, the transformation was administrative and political. Power shifted from a centralized union to the newly formed Russian Federation. Once again, the Grand Kremlin Palace adapted. The Kremlin remained the seat of national authority, now housing the presidency of the Russian Federation. The palace resumed its ceremonial role, hosting state functions, diplomatic meetings, and inaugurations. Its halls continued to frame power, even as the ideology behind that power shifted once more. Restoration efforts gained momentum in the 1990s. Decades of Soviet alterations had simplified or concealed certain imperial-era decorative elements. Specialists worked to restore historical interiors, particularly within the grand halls originally designed in the 19th century. Gilded ornamentation was repaired. Emblems associated with pre-revolutionary orders were reinstated in ceremonial spaces. The restoration was not an attempt to revive monarchy, but to acknowledge architectural heritage. The palace's layered past, imperial, Soviet, and post-Soviet, became part of its identity. Rather than erase previous eras, preservation efforts sought to reveal continuity beneath political change. Today, the Grand Kremlin Palace functions primarily as a ceremonial venue rather than a residential one. Official receptions take place beneath vaulted ceilings, originally constructed to inspire loyalty to a czar. Presidential inaugurations unfold within halls once reserved for imperial orders of chivalry. International leaders are received within rooms that have witnessed coronations, revolutionary councils, wartime planning, and diplomatic negotiations. Security surrounding the complex is stringent. Public access is limited and tightly controlled. Yet the exterior silhouette remains one of the most recognizable in the world. Illuminated at night, the palace rises behind red walls that have defined Moscow's skyline for centuries. Its survival is not simply a matter of stone enduring weather. It reflects a capacity for reinvention. The building has outlasted the Romanov dynasty, the Soviet Union, and multiple invasions. Each era redefined its purpose without relocating its foundations. Architecturally, it remains anchored to the 19th century. Politically, it continues to evolve. The same walls that once framed autocracy now frame a modern state navigating its own uncertainties. History often erases symbols of former regimes. Palaces are abandoned, residences become museums, strongholds crumble into ruins. The Grand Kremlin Palace defied that pattern. It neither fell into decay nor froze as a static relic. Instead, it absorbed transformation. From Napoleonic explosives to aerial bombardment, from revolution to dissolution, its existence has repeatedly hung in the balance. Yet it stands, altered, repurposed, but intact. Within its chambers, layers of authority remain embedded in marble and gold leaf. The building's meaning has shifted with each generation, but its presence has not. And as political currents continue to change in the 21st century, the palace endures at the center of Russian power, a structure shaped not by a single regime, but by survival itself.